And we are joined now by Sarah Brayne, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, author of Predict and Surveil, Data, Discretion, and the Future of Policing. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So your book is broadly about the police state, and its increasing encroachment on our digital footprint and mass
Mhm.
surveillance in mass, essentially. But what I loved about your work and what makes it so unique is that you were in the field with the LAPD for what, 5 years? Something like
Yeah, I
that?
mean, it wasn't 5 years straight, but yeah, it was over the course of 5 years, pretty intensively for about 2.5 years. I was there sort of doing observations and interviews with individuals there.
So, I mean, what was behind your focus on the LAPD in particular? And I know that your field is sociology, so field work's incredibly important. But was that really central to the story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, so I mean, broadly, I was interested in how, big data, predictive analytics, artificial intelligence was being adopted by the police because it's being adopted by folks in a whole range of institutions, right? Like education and finance, sports, everything. And so I wanted to pick a law enforcement agency that was pretty technologically advanced, kind of like on the front lines of some of this stuff. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, I narrowed down my potential field sites to the LAPD, Chicago PD, and NYPD. They have the biggest budgets, they're the most technologically advanced. And while they're using big data in different ways, I thought that there would be interesting findings regardless of what agency I did the field work with. And I settled on the LAPD because of the level of access that I was able to get. And so I was, able to go on ride alongs with individuals in cop cars and interview sworn officers and civilian employees in a whole bunch of divisions, like area and specialized divisions from, robbery, homicide, juvenile, fugitive warrants, information technology division, records and identification, all of that kind of thing. So it really was, I was relatively agnostic as to which exact department I would do, but I just really wanted to pick one that might kind of show us the direction policing is heading, and what smaller
Gotcha.
agencies might look like.
Yeah, Sarah, just your I think your mic's hitting your clothes or your hair a little
Oh,
bit. So
sorry.
just yeah, no problem. And you sound good. Just a little bit of scratching that should be
Okay.
fixed now.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean the, the LAPD in terms of some of the work that you were able to do and the access that you got, what drove them giving you the level of access that was so helpful to your research compared to like how did you realize that I was going to get the best uh dragnet to use their term or the best research opportunity here? Was it because of some of the kind of infrastructure put in place post Rodney King where there is a lot of logging?
Yeah, I mean, so you raise an interesting point, right? And that is basically that this kind of research is a form of surveillance in itself. So it gets like kind of meta that I'm like surveilling the surveillors in order to say something about surveillance. But yeah, so the LAPD did adopt a lot of data intensive or data driven decision making practices, largely in the wake of, well, the 1990s was a bad decade for the LAPD, right? You raised Rodney King, but there were also all of these civil rights violations unrelated to that. And so they were under a consent decree. Basically, they were sued by the feds and said, look, in exchange for the withdrawal of a criminal charge, you need to comply by all of these standards. And a lot of that had to do with using data, um, numbers and stuff instead of just like biased or human discretionary decision making in order to make decisions. So that's part of why they are kind of a leader, like on the front lines of this use of technology. In terms of why they gave me the access that I did, I mean, it's difficult to ever know people's motivations or intentions. And I definitely did not have like summary access to the department when I started the field work. It all just started with one meeting and then one ride along. And then I just did, what we call snowball sampling, really just asking more and more people, spending more and more time there. But I think part of it was that a lot of folks in the department are very proud of how technologically advanced they are, and
Mm.
my questions were like, can you show me all of the cool stuff you can do with data, like how technologically advanced you are. And so I think it kind of depends on like where you're coming from. normatively, ideologically, politically, how you understand or make sense of these types of tools and findings. But from their perspective, I mean, it's a good thing.
Yes, and I would say, look, we're a progressive news show. That's a major cause for concern here, obviously. So I want to now dive a little bit deeper. You uh, in your book differentiate between dragnet surveillance, which I alluded to earlier, and directed, and how basically, post 9/11, we know because of the Snowden
Yeah.
revelations that
Yeah.
there was a lot of national dragnet surveillance
Yes.
in the United States.
Yes.
You kind of uncover how that's happening with these major police departments at the local
Mhm.
municipal level, but like in a huge city like Los Angeles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're exactly right. Post 9/11, there was this huge influx in federal funds into increased surveillance. But the people who are really on the ground collecting that data day to day, a lot of it is local law enforcement agencies. And then they send that information up to fusion centers, which are these, typically federally funded multi-agency, multidisciplinary surveillance organizations that aggregate all this information, and then they make that available to the feds, that information available to the feds. So these fusion centers, they were created in the wake of 9/11, largely because the terrorist attacks were viewed as like a case of information sharing failure in the intelligence community. And so they said, okay, look, if we can get all of the information that on the ground local law enforcement is collecting, make it available to the feds, they're sort of on the front lines of the war against domestic terror. And so it began sort of as this like federal counterterror thing, but then there's this concept called function creep, right? The idea that like data originally collected for one purpose can be increasingly used for another. And so then local law enforcement is like, hey, we can start using this data too for our local policing.
Right. And that's kind of how all policing works, right? The reason that police have access to advanced weaponry and you see glorified tanks rolling through people's hometowns is
Yeah, like the
because
pumpkin festival in New Hampshire and
yeah,
all that. Yeah.
it's because a lot of the excess kind of militarized weaponry
Hmm.
then it gets turned on you domestically. Whatever militarism the United States is engaging in abroad, I mean, like frankly, we're seeing this is beyond the scope of your research, but we're seeing this with
Huh.
Israel right now, where
Yeah.
they are
Hmm.
the fascism is coming home, and what they've inflicted on the Palestinians, what we did in the war on terror came into our own police departments, and it accelerated a lot of the abuses that like have become notorious, obviously.
I think the militarization story, I'm trying to shed light on this kind of hidden part of that, which is, like you said, there's been some good coverage of the militarization of police in terms of local police departments getting access to surplus military kit, like the military hardware, right?
Hmm.
But I think that a really important and pretty invisible part of this story is also the creep of military software, right? Like data and surveillance technologies originally created for, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, then being deployed in the local context, like you're saying. And a lot of the time that's not as visible as like a tank rolling down the street or, responding with military gear to protests or something like that. But I think it's still a very important part of the story because it imports that like military logic, that
Hmm.
counterinsurgent logic into local policing.
What were some of the examples off the top of your head that you saw of that logic and how kind of casually it's deployed?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think like a classic example is the use of this platform designed by Palantir Technologies. So
Oh boy.
Palantir, yeah,
Yeah.
okay, so you guys probably talk about that. So anyway, for those who don't know, Palantir is this like data integration platform, has all kinds of government and commercial customers. Okay, initially funded by InQtel, which is the CIA's venture capital fund. Anyway, they create this data integration platform where you can combine all of these previously disparate sources of data. It was originally created for counterterror efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, like I was saying. And now that is sort of the platform that the LAPD uses to integrate disparate sources of data. So everything from 911 calls to automatic vehicle or automatic license plate reader readings. That's an example of a dragnet surveillance tool. You don't have to have done anything wrong, committed any crime in order to have your car picked up by these automatic license plate readers that are all over the city. And so in this platform, then you have understandings of the distribution of people in a city, and you can build out these like social networks, for example, and create, risk scores of people that are more or less likely to commit crime in the future. And so I think it's really like the importation and deployment of these tools. This is like one of the vectors through which we're finding this playing out in the local law enforcement context.
Right. I mean, and it also it's the I guess it was Foucault who wrote about the surveillance tower within prisons
Yeah,
and
the
how
panopticon.
the pen there we go.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about that since college in a
I know.
way.
I was like college. Let's get back
Yeah,
to the.
let's tap back into that moment. But like that, but that's what that is, right? It's the nature of pre-crime, and how you constantly feel like you're under surveillance because the reality is that I mean, people aren't aware of this in the way they should be, and that's why your book is so important. But that's the philosophy of policing behind this kind of stuff.
I think so. I think it's so. I mean, like surveillance scholars love to get in arguments about Foucault or whatever, which I will not get into here to like totally bore your listeners and your
We're
viewers.
very dry over
But
here. Don't worry.
but yeah, basically, I think that okay. So the way the panopticon thing works is that then the logic is that people start to police themselves, right? Because they don't know if the guy in the central tower is looking at them and policing them or not. So it's like this very efficient use of power. I think there's some of that going on with this, the electronic panopticon, if you will. But also, I think part of its power of like electronic surveillance is this invisibility that it can seep into our lives. We don't
No,
know
you're
what
right.
digital traces are
Yeah.
like. But no, I do think it is definitely a useful metaphor. This idea of omnipresent surveillance, like all these digital traces we leave in the course of our everyday lives, perhaps no one of them we would take issue with the police having access to, right? It's like, oh, you write something in the public domain on the internet, or you make some purchase or whatever, fine. But what legal scholars and lawyers are really up in arms about is this idea that the aggregation of all of these little digital traces that we leave grants the government a level of insight into our lives that totally previously would have constituted a search, and therefore like had these legal requirements or thresholds that must be met. But now that's just like not the case in the digital world.
Yeah, I mean one of the constitutional erosions that does not get discussed enough is just the complete erosion of the Fourth Amendment. And
Yeah.
every time over the 20th century, the case law on that front, and then this is really
Yeah.
beyond the scope of your book, but like the case law on that front is it pretty much universal every time in giving police more discretion for a drug dog to come up to the a crack in your front door and smell, and that doesn't constitute a search for reasonable suspicion in the way that people are driving around in their cars. All of this has been throughout the ideology changes on the Supreme Court, been a fairly universal kind of push towards giving police a lot of this, and then there's the stuff that we don't know about that you write, which is like the the August Vollmer guy that
Yeah.
you speak about here, who had military background
Yeah.
in the Philippines. Talk a bit about that, because that's also bringing that seems like a
Yeah.
great example of the military mentality seeping into the policing in cities that you discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you know what? There is a great book coming out that's a lot about this Vollmer guy by someone named Julian Go at the University of Chicago soon. It's all about imperialism and policing
Ooh,
and stuff. Anyway, so future potential guests, but
right.
yeah, right. So like I guess Vollmer, he was the chief of police in Berkeley, and he's kind of considered like the father of modern policing. And yep, indeed, he was sort of deployed in the Philippines. He was doing this policing, and he brought back a lot of the like we were saying, sort of technologies and logics, like the idea of pin mapping, right? Plotting in different places where things were occurring in order to predict where they were more likely to occur in the future and send their resources. The resources are slightly different in the local law enforcement context than they would have been like in imperial Philippines, but it's sort of like the same type of counterinsurgency thing. And so it was really a combination of like both the actual technologies, call boxes, the use of like being able to communicate between people on the front and central command, right? And of course, local law enforcement agencies, like they mirror the military in their organizational structure and in their chain of command. And so I think it's like a relatively easy importation strategy that occurs there.
Right. And the I guess that was going back a little bit in history, but to keep it to our current moment, I'm curious what if you could expand a little bit more on the tech companies that are so intertwined with the LAPD. You mentioned Palantir and how they use those kinds of
Sure.
tools. Palantir is a Peter Thiel
Mhm.
company as well, and he has dipped his toe in a lot of like
Mhm.
technological services, then and works with the government in particular. I think he also was trying to do stuff along the border. But what is that dynamic of
Mhm.
police working with capitalists to
Yeah.
further their technological advances?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of motivations for why this is an effective thing for the police to do. So, on the one hand, a lot of the time, police departments just don't have the relevant in house expertise, right? Technology is becoming more advanced. So, what they do is they contract out or hire private companies in order to design some of the key analytic platforms that they use. And, I would go to these like surveillance industry conferences in DC, for example, which was super interesting because what I thought I was going to see was local law enforcement agencies, like police departments, going to tech firms and being like, hey, these are particular needs that we have. Can you build some software or platform that helps us with this? That was like mostly not what I saw. In
Mm,
fact, it was like the surveillance companies saying, hey, like check out how our platform is used in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Like, isn't this fascinating? Or for dealing with like piracy, and like these different like maritime fronts and whatnot. Maybe you want to use that to catch bad guys in your city. And so it was this kind of like inverse of what I thought the supply demand thing was going to be. So anyway, first, they don't have the in-house expertise. Second, I mean, you brought up the Fourth Amendment and whatnot. There are more laws and regulations on what the government can do, like what government agencies can do, which, police departments are one of, in terms of like intrusion into individuals' lives, data they can collect. So by relying on private companies a lot of the time to just collect some of these data and then they just buy it from them, local law enforcement just buys it from them through data brokers, right? Like LexisNexis, for example, which
mm.
the LAPD again accesses through a portal in Palantir. They can circumvent a lot of these like legal and regulatory and reporting requirements that come with like public agencies collecting
Right.
this
It's like a
information on
client.
people.
It's a client relationship as
Yeah,
opposed to a
exactly.
public service
Exactly.
one.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, hey, like we don't want to really get into this legally contestable territory or have this fought in court. So like, why don't we just buy it from somebody else?
It's just amazing. I mean, it like what were some of the police officers' reactions to this? You hinted at the fact that a lot of them were really impressed by the scope of the technology and the capacity, but you also spend a lot of time with LAPD officers. What was their kind of some of the experiences that you had when you asked them about a lot of this?
Yeah, so I think that there was generally this pervasive idea, not uniformly, there was variation within the department, but this pervasive idea of like, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Like,
Mm,
if you haven't done anything wrong, then why do you care if the police are collecting data on you? And, okay, I understand that logic. However, it was really interesting to me. Like, on my very first ride along, we were responding to a 911 call, like a call for service about a possible break in at this like abandoned house, or it was under construction or something. Anyway, and in the cop car, the sergeant pulls up to this address and types in manually to his in car computer that he's code 6 at a particular address, meaning like we'd arrived at the scene. And in that moment, I was like, oh my God, I picked the LAPD because I thought they were so technologically advanced. Like, why does this guy have to manually type in his location in his computer? Is there not like some automated mechanism for the department tracking or knowing where the vehicles are? So I asked him about it. And he said, oh, yeah, every car is equipped with an AVL or an automatic vehicle locator that pings the location of the car every 5 seconds, but they're not turned on because of resistance from the police officers union.
mm,
And so it was in that second that I was like, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, right? Like there's this
right.
like cognitive dissonance, kind of like that logic just disappeared in their sense making when applied to them, because a collateral consequence of a lot of this digital policing is that the police are coming under increased surveillance by their managers. And so, yeah, it was just like a really interesting moment of resistance. And then I saw other examples of that in my field work. But I think generally that's their response is like, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But then when it actually plays out, it looks a bit different.
Yeah, I'm curious too about the role of body cam footage in the way that
Yeah.
some of these officers respond. Because I printed this out because I knew I was having you on today. I read this yesterday. It was this Cal
Okay.
Matters article. I mean, we don't need to go into it, but it was
Yeah.
about this like cottage industry now of video editors who are putting out the body cam footage to the public, but it's
Okay.
very particular. And I just that it struck a chord with me given what you had said there, that
Mm-hmm.
anecdote in particular, where it's like body cam footage is supposed to be about transparency, but how do we have oversight as to like what we're even seeing?
Yeah, I mean, and there is no like at the federal level regulations about the collection, the storage, the publication of any. It is like the
Yeah.
regulatory Wild West. So much variation. For the most part, it's typically still expecting the police to police themselves, unless a case makes it up to higher courts, etc. But yeah, I mean the body cam thing, they were basically being rolled out while I was in the field. So I don't really have like a systematic account of their use in the
Hmm.
book. But I think that like a lot of the same dynamics are at play here. And the way that I really talk about data in the book, if you think about like body cam footage being a form of data, right? Is that like we shouldn't think of data as just some sort of like objective reflection of
Yes.
reality. Rather, it's like interpreted through prisms and power structures and all of this stuff. It's like a form of capital, right? And so, if this body cam footage is only available to local law enforcement agencies or to sort of police themselves, I think its potential to like increase transparency and accountability is like pretty limited. It has to be drastic changes in ownership of these data and access to these data if you actually want to have that meaningful change.
Yes. But I mean the change probably has to come from the outside or the
Yeah.
desire for it.
Yes.
I mean we see this in the context of politics when we're talking about algorithms.
Yeah.
Like it just we have made data into some sort of a pagan god that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that is all knowing and not
Yeah.
influenced by humanity, and it's a construction of humanity, so that's literally impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, you said it well. It's sort of like it's a construction in a way. Absolutely. And we really see this playing out in the context of predictive policing, like with the police, right? So police do predictive policing where they use predictive algorithms in order to predict where and who is likely to be involved in crime in the future. And then they send cops to those areas.
Hmm.
And so the LAPD, uses a predictive policing algorithm designed by, it used to be called Predpol, now it's called Geolytica. It's basically one of the biggest predictive policing software companies in the world. And they take historical crime data and then spit out basically this 500 square foot box of where crime is likely to occur. And then the police go to that area and such. Now, what ends up happening, right, though, is kind of this like self-fulfilling prophecy wherein, okay, well, the police are more likely to go to that area. Well, then they can become more likely to detect crime in that area or observe crime in that area, which then feeds into the predictive policing algorithm and then tells them to spend more time in this area. So it can become kind of this like feedback loop or ratchet effect.
Yeah. And
And
it's sorry,
but
go
it
on.
comes across as like objective, right?
Yes.
And like detached from these social processes, right? One officer referred to it as just math, right? And it's like, no, it's not just math. It is all, algorithms are not just like detached or purely descriptive. It's people situated within these like pre-existing organizational contexts and social contexts that collect data and decide what data to collect and analyze about whom and for what purpose and what to do with the data. So I think sometimes in some of the like RoboCop type analogies, that really really important human role can kind of get lost or fade away. It's like, oh,
Yeah,
we're
it's the
policed by
same.
computers. It's like, no, it's actually people just using
Yes, it's
computers.
the same thing they always did, going and policing
Yeah.
poor black neighborhoods,
Yeah.
but now they just have data that tells them to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean that's just I don't love it creates plausible deniability as opposed to kind of more of a robust understanding.
Well, and I'm interested to, yeah, see how it's thought about in courts. in coming years, right? Like we
Yeah.
have this pacing problem with tech where technology happens so much faster, technological advancement happens so much faster than laws and regulations that govern it. So, I think it'll be like 10, 15 years in the Supreme Court we'll be seeing this kind of stuff. But like absolutely, I think that it will be litigated and debated. It's like, did you stop this guy because of his risk score or whatever? So
Right.
yeah.
Well, Sarah Brayne, the book, Predict and Surveil, Data, Discretion, and the Future of Policing, won the Surveillance Studies Network's 2021 Book Award. So it's a big deal. I'd encourage everybody to buy it if they can. Check it out. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We'll put a link to your book in the description everywhere you're watching or listening to this and at majority.fm.
Thanks so much.
Of course.